Great. So we're going to jump in today and talk about a collaborative open source modeling project that many of us on the call here have been part of for the last year or so, looking at how to compare and understand the roles of the different open source electricity system capacity expansion models, how they're structured and how that impacts the outcomes that we see from those models. But to set the stage, I want to talk just broadly about what this class of models is useful for, and why it's so important that we understand their inner workings and develop best practices and open source tools that can be broadly used. So electricity system capacity expansion models or capacity planning tools are used quite broadly across the sector. They're used directly in utility integrated resource planning processes in states and in jurisdictions where utilities are vertically integrated or where states are undergoing sector-wide planning processes, as they do in California, for example. They're used in investment planning and valuation by competitive companies trying to decide what portfolio of power plants to build or invest in, or how to value acquisitions or investments. They're used quite broadly to understand the impact of policy and regulatory impact, because we can directly model, in many cases, the influences of certain policy decisions or regulations or subsidies or penalties right within these models themselves, and help understand their potential impact, costs and benefits, et cetera. They're used for indicative planning, planning how do we get how do we broadly transition the energy economy towards, say, net zero greenhouse gas emissions, or to achieve other social or societal goals. So those plans aren't directly implemented by anybody, but they provide us with an indication of the kinds of roadmaps and strategies that are needed to transition the power system. And they can be used to evaluate emerging energy technologies, where we can plug in emerging technologies like long duration energy storage or others into the grid to understand how they might operate in the grid of the future. In the past, capacity expansion planning models, which have been around really since the 60s and are kind of an early application of linear programming, were focused primarily on one of two types of systems that dominated the world. Primarily thermal power systems, where you had a mix of dispatchable thermal power plants, coal, gas, oil, nuclear, et cetera, where the primary question was how to develop a mix of resources that have different fixed and variable costs that are suited to the different utilization rates that arise from the fact that we have variable electricity demand across years and seasons. So that's what's shown in the graphic here. Separately, there are large parts of the world that are dominated by hydrothermal systems, with large hydropower systems with large reservoirs, where the primary concern there is about managing uncertainty or stochasticity, regional and seasonal or annual and seasonal variability in stream flows for the hydropower systems to make sure you have enough energy, you're saving the water for when you need it. And these two classes of models were developed quite well and used quite broadly. Next. Those worked quite well until the rise of variable renewable energy resources, which pose a set of really new challenges for this class of model, and they've challenged them computationally and methodologically, which is the motivation behind a lot of the models that we'll talk about today. The rise of variable renewables introduces a whole bunch of new challenges. We need to be thinking about co-optimizing generation, storage, and transmission expansion, because the location-based resources, wind or solar or others, impose new trade-offs around the availability of the resource, tapping into better quality resources, but building out more expensive transmission capacity to do so, or maybe building closer to existing transmission or demand, but in a lower quality resource. We have to be thinking about hourly or finer operational resolution so that we can understand the impact of flexibility needs driven by variable renewable resources, wind and solar power, and their variation from hour to hour. We have to be able to capture detailed, chronological operating constraints, so we are sure that we're planning power systems that have the flexibility that we need to meet supply and demand at all times. That demands a high spatial and temporal resolution, which blows up the size of these models. Ideally, we'd even be planning over multiple weather years, right, to ensure that the systems we're planning are robust to uncertainty, robust to changing weather patterns from climate change, and increasingly considering the role of electricity as a common energy carrier across the economy. We need to be thinking about sector coupling as well. So this has driven in the academic world a drive to build newer models, models that are fit for purpose to understand the energy transition that's underway and to capture the challenges and opportunities posed by emerging technologies and wind and solar power. Next. There are a range of, got the link there, I think we clicked. There are now a range of these open source energy system modeling tools that have grown out of various academic labs and are now quite mature. They've been used for many years, developed and used by a range of academic research groups, and increasingly in other nonprofit and for-profit contexts as well. And so this project was designed to bring together 4 of those models that represent some of the state of the art in the field, and to understand how they compare to one another, how they function, and to help develop sort of a user guide for the available tools out there. Just let the slides catch up here. Yeah, perfect. So, oh, there we go. So at their core, each of these models is basically trying to do the same thing, which is they're set up as minimization, cost minimization, or social welfare maximization optimization problems. So we're trying to maximize social welfare or minimize the cost of meeting expected future electricity demand, say 5, 10, 15, 20 years into the future, by co-optimizing a set of key decisions: where, when, and how to invest in or retire existing generation and storage capacity, so our capacity planning decisions; how to dispatch or operate that capacity, as well as schedule flexible demand, if that's part of the model, across all the hours of your planning years; how to schedule price responsive demand that might be responding to prices and curtail when power prices are too high or supply is scarce; how to operate or cycle or commit thermal generators that have some important engineering-based flexibility constraints about when and how long it takes them to turn on and how long they have to stay on once they operate, so unit commitment decisions; and where and how to invest in additional transmission network capacity to increase power transmission capacity or transfer capacity between different regions or zones. All of those decisions are then subject to a set of key engineering and physical constraints that capture the key kind of physics and engineering of the grid and the technologies for generation and storage. Market balance constraints, right? Supply has to equal demand. Resource availability limits, which are important particularly for variable renewables, right? You need to know the supply curves for wind and solar and where in different locations. And then other environmental reliability, market design, and policy constraints that really help us model this socio-technical system, including all of those kind of key policy objectives or market designs. All of these are formulated as linear programs or mixed integer linear programs, which have very well-developed commercial and open source solvers that are quite efficient at solving this type of problem. So this is sort of the general sketch of each of these models. There's some differences under the hood that we're trying to unpack with this study, but all of them have the same kind of core structure. With that, I'll hand things over to Matthias to talk more about the intermodal comparison project that we have here. Thanks.
Thanks, Jesse. Yeah, so I guess taking from where Jesse left off, we're dealing with a class of models that are quite good for designing a power system that can meet deep decarbonization goals. But you've probably all seen studies that have been done with these type of models, and they produce often quite different results. And it can be very difficult for people who are trying to interpret those studies or potentially set up studies of their own with these models to judge, okay, is this a bias in the model? Is it a difference in the assumptions and data that they used and so forth? So this project is designed to kind of unpack that uncertainty and to help identify which models, or more specifically, which configuration choices you use for the model will be most effective for answering particular types of policy questions or studying particular scenarios. So that's a key goal of this project, is to compare all of these. And I guess we didn't give a huge setup at the start, but the partners in this are listed along the bottom. There's Jesse's group at Princeton. There's another group based from Carnegie Mellon University using the TIMOA model. Another group that uses the switch model across a few different universities, including EDF and University of Hawaii and UC San Diego, and then also USNSYS. And the goal is to empower stakeholders to use these models to understand which ones will work well. And we're also publishing all the data that we use in this study. So that's an important sort of secondary goal, is we're not just going to compare them, we're going to set it up so that anyone can use this national scale data and these sort of scenarios as a turnkey setup so they can get up and running really easily. And there's a sort of secondary goal, but for many of us, probably one of the more exciting goals is also to try to provide policy insights about what future decarbonization looks like and where do these models agree or disagree about findings. So you'll hear a little bit more about that in the first half hour. So I jumped ahead, I guess. These are the 4 models that we're working with. They're all being linked up to Power Genome, which is a great open source source of US grid data that you can use for exactly this kind of purpose. And if any of you have ever tried to run models, you know that gathering the data is often the hardest part. And so that's been a really key element of this, is linking them all up to use this shared national data infrastructure. I think we can move on to the next slide. So I think I covered the first bullet point here, but I'm going to just dwell a little bit on the fact that when you see different findings from different models, it's easy to assume, oh, it's just Gen X works that way and Switch works that way or Tomoa works that way. But actually internally, as Jesse was saying, these models are quite similar. And so we worked very hard in this study to tease out what's a difference that's sort of fundamental between the models in the structure of the model and how they sort of think about power systems, and what's a difference in the configuration of the models, which is the sort of assumptions and data that you're using to set it up and run it. And so, as you'll see on the next slide coming up, our approach is to run all the models with identical configurations. That's shown along the left side here. So we have sort of a few different configurations that are ways you could set up the model, and within each of those we run all 4 models. And then we repeat that process for a bunch of different scenarios. And today you'll hear about our current policies scenario, which is quite a detailed representation of policies that exist now in the US. And then for most of this work, we had a reference case, which is a very deep decarbonization scenario, where essentially you need to get sort of above 90% emission reductions from day one, but you have a $200 buyout. So it's roughly just a $200 carbon cost kind of scenario. And then a bunch of other scenarios that are sort of deviations from that to see, that you might use to study particular policy questions that are of interest. And so you can sort of see a grid here where we've run every model across every configuration, across every scenario. And the goal here, as I said before, is to see within a particular scenario, do these configuration choices make a difference? And then subject to that, even within, you've set them all up to use a similar configuration, do the individual model formulations make a difference? And so we're able to sort of tease that out with this framework. And I think that might be all the slides I have setting up what we're doing here. Yeah, so now we'll hand over for a deeper dive on a couple of those scenarios.
Sure, thanks.
Choices.
So hi, everybody. I'm Cameron Wade with Sutubra Research. I work closely with the team at Carnegie Mellon on the Tomoa model. And so I'm going to dive in, going to take 5 or 6 minutes looking at some kind of results, looking at which model features should you activate for which questions, and we'll look at the question of what's cost effective under current policies. So kind of in the scenario configuration speak, we're looking at the current policies scenario, and I'm going to talk about some different configurations we looked at and what sort of kind of findings or learnings came from that. So off the bat, just a really high-level overview of what we mean by current policies. So this includes the Inflation Reduction Act, so all the PTCs and ITCs and other provisions that come with that. This includes some regional renewable portfolio standards or clean electricity standards, offshore wind targets, and regional emission limits like RGGI. Of note, current policies do not include any sort of national emission cap or CO2 cap that the other scenarios contain. Next. And so here are the 4 different configurations we modeled, assuming current policy. The first 2 deal with how we treat time, so whether or not we're using 20 or 52 weeks per year, and how investment decisions are made, whether that has perfect foresight or myopic decision making. I'll get into all these in detail in turn. Third, we looked at the logic or the basis for retirement decisions, whether those are simply age-based or if those have economic retirement decisions. And finally, we looked at kind of dispatch configuration. So when we're looking or modeling thermal generators, are we doing full unit commitment or are we doing a highly simplified version? So next slide, please. To begin with, we'll talk about some findings that we found when we looked at the difference between the retirement logic. And so just to go into a little bit of detail here, the two versions are age-based, which is you kind of exogenously set when different assets retire, which is quite simple. There's no decision being made by the model, whereas the economic retirement, we endogenize the retirement decisions on a least cost basis. Next slide, please. Okay, and so the main takeaway here is that the basis upon which retirement decisions are made strongly influences model outcomes. And to illustrate that, we can look here at some capacity decisions. So in the different columns, we have 3 of the different models that we used. And in the rows, we have 3 different resources of note. So the first row is coal, then nuclear, then batteries. And we're plotting the total capacity in gigawatts of these resources. The red lines indicate the age-based retirement configuration, and the teal lines correspond to the economic retirement. Next slide. And so the first thing we see is that when we activate economic retirement, we see that over 50% of the coal fleet's economically retired in the very first planning period of 2027. This largely retires the older, more inefficient coal plants. Next slide. Second, we see that once the IRA provisions expire, about half the nuclear fleet economically retires. And that's largely driven by high fixed operations and maintenance costs. And these retirement decisions are reflected, in CO2 emissions, which is what's pictured here. And so same color, so red is the age-based retirement, teal is economic retirement. And so what we see is that there's an immediate decrease in system-wide emissions in the economic retirement case, and that's largely attributed to much of the coal fleet retiring and therefore not dispatching. And in both cases, we see quite a big rebound once the IRA provisions expire, but that rebound is more pronounced in the economic retirement configuration because there is essentially only half the nuclear fleet online providing that clean, firm power supply. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to briefly look at what I'm calling the treatment of time. And so the first 2 configurations, what I'm talking about first, how many weeks per year do we include? Generally speaking, the more weeks, the better. The more weather, the more variability we're seeing, but the higher computational burden. And second, the investment perspective. Perfect foresight is when we're optimizing all investment decisions at once. When you're making investment decisions in the early years, you know what's coming, down the line in terms of cost reductions or policy changes. Whereas myopic, we solve in all planning periods sequentially with no information of the future. Next slide, please. And so what we find is that myopic decision-making, at least in the current policies scenario, impacts model outcomes. And to illustrate this, again, we'll use the power sector emissions. Again, here we're looking at switch and US Census emissions, but it's consistent across all 4 models. And we're comparing the case of perfect foresight in orange to myopic decision-making in green. And what we find is that simulations using perfect foresight see increased system-wide emissions. This is largely because the system anticipates or can see that the IRA provisions expire and thus selects to make fewer early investments in wind and solar, knowing that the PTCs are going to expire, right? And this is, of course, on the basis of cost minimization. The other tidbit worth mentioning here is that we found very, very little effect from changing from 52 weeks per year to 20 weeks per year. So that's another finding that's quite interesting. Next slide, please. Okay, and the final tidbit we'll get to is the generator dispatch. So as I mentioned, we included simplified dispatch. So there's really no unit level constraints here versus unit commitment where generators have to obey unit commitment constraints like min downtime, min uptime, minimum load, startup costs, things like this. Next slide, please. There's too much to get into here, but I can summarize the takeaway by saying that by including unit commitment, it has very little effect on investment decisions, but it has a marginal but measurable effect on generation and emissions. And in general, what we find is that when we activate unit commitment constraints, there's increased generation from thermal plants, and there's marginally less generation or more curtailment from wind and solar. Next slide, please. So to recap, the question we were asked was which model feature should you activate when modeling current policies? And we found that retirement logic plays an important role, particularly with respect to coal and nuclear. And so it's likely a good option to activate economic retirement. We found that perfect foresight resulted in different investment decisions. And this tends to be the case when there are abrupt shifts in policies, such as the expiration of IRA. And so it's likely a good option to activate perfect foresight when modeling current policies. We found negligible changes between 20 and 50 representative weeks per planning year. And so we might as well use 20 representative weeks and save on some compute. And finally, we found that unit commitment had minimal impact on optimal resource portfolios with only marginal effects on generation and emissions. And so simplified operations might suffice, but if you've got some compute to use, you can go ahead and use it there. And I think that's everything I have. Thanks.
Excuse me. Hello, I'm Michael Roberts. I'm at the University of Hawaii, and I work with the Switch team on this project, mostly managing a postdoc, Rongrong Zhang, who did a lot of the work for the Switch team on this project. So I actually get kind of the fun job where I'm going to talk about some of the high-level results from this across the different models once we've kind of harmonized some of these configuration decisions that Cameron was talking about. Kind of 4 take-home messages that I'll tell you right up front, that some of which I think are pretty well known and some maybe not so much. Deep decarbonization is possible, and it's pretty affordable. But the last 5 to 10% of decarbonization of the electricity sector is pretty costly, at least in relative terms. Current policy, however, is not nearly doing enough to decarbonize at the rates that we'd like to see. And then I'm going to talk a bit about the transmission results. We have a series of transmission scenarios that look at how much transmission can help. And massive expansion of interregional transmission really helps, but it may not help as much as you think, because batteries, it turns out, and other changes in the mix of generation can substitute for that. So the fourth thing is, once we kind of understand each other's models and we harmonize some of the decisions and the configurations, there is remarkable agreement across the models about kind of key things. They're not identical, as you'll see, but remarkable agreement across, about the generation mix, the emissions, and the costs across a very wide range of scenarios. So first, I'll talk a little bit about these particular scenarios. There's a lot of scenarios we've looked at, and I should provide some links here at the end where you can kind of explore all these scenarios and interactive graphs, a great thing that Greg set up. But this is what I'll look at right now. We're going to look at the deep decarbonization pathways, where we have kind of a plan, a constraint on reducing carbon emissions at a very rapid rate, but there's an escape valve. It's not exactly like a carbon price. It only charges a price of carbon above the target decarbonization, and there are 3 different price levels: $50, $200 per ton, and $1,000. Our baseline for most of our scenarios is $200, which is around the price that EPA is currently targeting for the social cost of carbon. For transmission, the alternative transmission scenarios, one is very strict, no expansion interregionally. You will have a lot of expansion of transmission within regions when you connect resources. That's kind of the big bottleneck these days. This doesn't consider that. It's only looking at between about 26 kind of aggregated regions. A constraint of 15% per corridor per 10 years, a constraint of 50% expansion per 10 years per corridor, and completely unconstrained if we were really to optimize transmission. And then all else in these scenarios is at the baseline of $200 per ton. Okay, so this is just kind of high-level results looking at what happens in emissions. It compares the carbon price policies, or this cap, rapid decarbonization, in comparison to existing policy. And this kind of gives you this headline number, pretty big splash made by Blistein et al. In Science a little while ago, basically making this point, and this shows it here as well. And under existing policy, we're not going to get nearly the carbon emissions reductions that we'd like to see. I will say that there still are pretty substantial reductions in this scenario. Something to keep in mind here is that over this time period, we're also modeling about a 75% increase in demand. So emissions are falling even while demand is increasing a lot, and hopefully some of that is decarbonization of other sectors. So there are declines under existing policies, and maybe pretty substantial declines, but not like what we'd like to see to really affect climate change. The cap is the solid. Well, let me just talk about some of these other lines here. The cap is the solid black line there at the bottom. That goes down to 0 by 2050. So that's very rapid, deep decarbonization, even with 75% growth of demand in the electricity sector. You can see that a carbon price of $50 doesn't do nearly as much, but it does a lot more than current policies. $1,000 basically gets you there, and $200 gets you almost there. Okay, we can go to the next slide. These are the same scenarios, but it shows you what it costs. And this is in dollars per megawatt hour. If you'd like to think about things in terms of cents per kilowatt hour, $50 per kilowatt hour here is about 5 cents per kilowatt hour. So, these kind of wholesale prices, I mean, this hasn't been, it's not a perfect apples to apples comparison, but, in recent years, we've seen wholesale prices that are considerably higher than this. So these are not, these are very affordable prices. One of the challenges under the current existing policy is that natural gas is just so darn cheap. And overcoming that very, very cheap natural gas when you already have a huge fleet of power plants out there is pretty difficult, even though you're subsidizing renewables a lot. So adding a carbon price is what you really need, and that pushes those out. And it's affordable, but definitely more expensive than what we have presently. Okay, next slide. So here I'm going to look at we're going to look at transmission, and this shows that on the far right of each of these bar plots shows existing transmission gigawatts. I think it's kind of gigawatt miles or something like that, or not exactly sure what that measure is, but it's giving us the total existing transmission is in the right bar. And then the other bars show how expansion occurs all the way out to 2050 with different shadings of the bars. And then you have different transmission scenarios, whether it's completely unconstrained, which is on the left side, and the intermediate cases where transmission can happen, but the amount of expansion is constrained. And you can see that ideally we would expand transmission, nearly 3 times. I should note this is all assuming a carbon price of $200. If you really wanted to decarbonize to 100% decarbonization, or like with $1,000 price or full decarbonization, it would be well over 400. So we would get like a full tripling of transmission expansion. So, and all the models are in a lot of agreement here. You can see how similar they are across the different models. Okay, next slide. And this shows costs. The scale here is identical to the previous slide. So you can see for comparison, if you remember what that looked like. But the completely unconstrained expansion is, of course, least cost, and you can see that on the bottom of the screen. All this is, the $200 carbon price. But if you only have existing transmission only, you're at the top line. And you can't even see it because they're kind of indistinguishable from each other. You see the plus 15 and plus 50% constrained expansion scenarios there in the middle. There are a bunch of different lines there, and you can't really see all the models. And I decided not to try to unpack that because I think it kind of shows you that the models are basically saying the same thing with remarkable clarity. We don't always see that in model comparisons. Okay. These unpack what kind of expansion, what we're doing with generation across different types of generation capacities. And you can see we're not going to really add any nuclear here. The critical thing is keeping old nuclear, and that can make a big difference if you keep the old nuclear, but it's really hard to find any scenarios where we're going to be adding much nuclear. It's really dominated by solar and wind. And there's a little bit going on there with combustion turbines, but mostly we'd be using the existing fleet of thermal generation. The next slide shows other key capacities. The one big piece of thermal generation is carbon capture and storage. We do see a lot of that. And you do see some differences across the scenarios in CCS and in batteries. You can see that there's about 50% more batteries with no expansion of transmission versus optimal expansion of transmission. So that's one of the key trade-offs. And there are subtle differences across the scenarios in the other generation capacities. And they can be larger within particular regions. I'm not really trying to unpack particular regions here. That takes a little bit more time, but you can kind of do that on the web page that I'll show. The natural gas combined cycle, there isn't a whole lot of that. And there isn't much hydrogen in here. If you really want to decarbonize to 100%, you basically substitute hydrogen for CCS. And that adds some costs. We don't have those scenarios here. Okay, I think that's it. That's all I've got. These two websites are two ways you can interact with the data. These are great sites and really helped us kind of coordinate and among ourselves. And now you can dive into the results might be updated a little bit more as we go forward. So I wouldn't say that they're final, but I don't expect they'll change a lot. One is an interactive graphic, so you can make your own graphs. And the second one has a lot of pre-made graphs across all the different scenarios. Okay, I guess that's it. I'll try to post a link to these in the chat.
Thank you to all our speakers. We now have a few minutes for questions, if any folks have questions, and then we'll take us into breakout rooms. But yeah, open to any questions now. If there are any, please feel free to raise your hand. I see a raised hand from Wilson.
I was curious as to why the big bump in overall cost per watt in 2030. Is there a particular driver of that you saw across the different scenarios? And is there anything you could do to mitigate that economic bump?
Well, under it's all basically driven by the cap. It's an assumed cap, and I think this comes from the repeat kind of targets that they considered. So it's kind of exogenously given that we want to decarbonize really, really fast. If we wanted to eliminate emissions really, really quickly by 2030, then you're going to get a pretty big bump in cost by 2030. So that would be my my main take on that. I don't know if someone else has another take on it.
I think one thing it's saying is if you do want to achieve these deep decarbonization, this does indeed start that by 2030, and so you start to see those higher marginal costs already by 2030. But that figure as well, I think that you're talking about at a base of 20. So what you were actually seeing was a rise from sort of $30 per megawatt hour now to $40 per megawatt hour in 2030, which is actually not it's sort of below the level of noise in people's power bills. So it's not a huge economic impact likely, but it does cost something to get to these very deep decarbonization levels.
We'll now take a question from Paul.
Hi, thank you. That was really a fine presentation. Could you say something about the wholesale price formation process that you're modeling, since that has implications for retirement decisions and entry decisions?
These are coming from the operations version of Gen X, I believe. And so they're basically marginal costs that are, and we're aggregating on a demand basis across all regions and all, megawatt hours to get an average. So there is, quite a bit of variability. At least for our own model, we've made some distribution plots of what that looks like. It's pretty wild. I'm a huge advocate of pushing for real-time pricing because the amount to which prices are going to increase in variability is pretty extraordinary. But those are just means taken over all megawatt hours and all demands.
So
we're basically
go ahead.
we're basically running the day ahead unit commitment. So these are day ahead prices effectively. We don't run the real time.
And
I guess I was on the other end. I mean, in the end, wholesale prices are an aggregation of market energy prices and then cost of service regulation, primarily for transmission. And are you trying to model how FERC cost of service regulation or state cost of service regulation would work for those portions of the grid that are regulated?
No.
These are more like LMPs. They're zonal marginal costs, which does include some of that transmission. But it's also, there's all kinds of stuff that happens in the real markets that pushes the operational markets out of equilibrium with the investment markets. And so ours are more in equilibrium than that. So we don't have sort of a planning reserve margin in the capacity planning stage, which would then drive you to overcapacity in the operational stage. They're both kind of working with the sort of right amount of capacity.
Yeah, this is a pretty simplified setup. One can design much more complicated representations of various market rules and constraints than we include in this intercomparison.
I mean, it seems to me this is an area where future work might be desirable. I know it's more of a regulatory accounting, but there really is a very substantial difference between the revenue requirements per regulation for a transmission network and the congestion revenues that you get from the difference in LMPs. I don't mean small. I mean, one is 10 times the other. So it seems to me it would be good to factor that into the analysis in terms of the cost implications and how that would affect retirement decisions.
So we account for the new build costs of transmission expansion, the full cost requirements for those. And so the model's only going to build those when avoided system costs are larger than the cost of the transmission expansion. We don't account for the sunk cost of the existing network in the dollars per megawatt hour that we're reporting here, and nor do we account for all the other things that work their way into the retail bill. So this is really just the wholesale prices and the transmission expansion that occurs in the model.
I think some of those sunk costs are there because it's a marginal. It's coming from the dual of the operational market. So if someone's getting rents on an existing asset, that would be reflected in there as well. But I mean, we should say this operational market is a much tighter one than the ISOs run because it's more like an energy only market where you build enough to recover costs and you stop there. And then it's very tight in the sense there's no expansion opportunity in the real-time market. It just goes to I don't even know if we have an unserved. No, I think we do have an unserved load cost. So it's like $5,000 a megawatt hour to shed load, but it can hit the cap anytime it needs to. So there's more revenue recovery here. Maybe that reflects some of what you're talking about, the sort of make-up payments that bridge that gap between a sort of oversupplied operating market and the capacity plant, the planning reserve margins that they have to have in the capacity market.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, at least when we've dug into transmission a little bit more for Switch, there are probably some lines that wouldn't have full cost recover under these rules, but most do, and some have positive rents. And depending upon the scenario, of course, there's a lot of rents if you don't expand. But I think probably the bigger issue there is that most regions don't really have fully competitive equilibrium pricing, and it's not long run equilibrium. So yeah, it's a very different world by the time you get out to 2050. There's a couple questions in the chat. Hydrogen doesn't really come in because we have this escape valve for carbon emissions. That's either 200 or 1,000 or $50 if it's, and hydrogen won't really come in unless you really need to eliminate everything. So hydrogen isn't cheap enough. So if you really want to go to zero, then hydrogen comes in, and it does bump up the cost a bit more, but not as much as you might imagine. But there is it's just outside the margin, and CCS is cheaper. So basically, have some modest emissions plus carbon capture and storage with natural gas.
And as Greg indicated in the chat as well, we just fixed we treated hydrogen like other fuels when you can just, purchase it. We're not, we didn't model, making hydrogen as a flexible load. And so I think I wouldn't say that this framework is able to answer kind of seasonal flexibility, because we're not making the hydrogen endogenously in the model, if that makes sense.
But I think Michael was quoting a bit from a side paper that we did where we did have endogenous hydrogen production. And generally in all my research, what I've tended to see is that using hydrogen in the power sector tends to cost more than $200 a ton of CO2 avoided, compared to carbon capture or just switching from fossil fuel to renewables. And so it doesn't tend to show up unless you have a really tight cap and no escape. You're willing to go to $1,000 or more per ton of CO2 avoided.
That's what we've energy outlook too, is you make a fair amount of it, but it's used primarily in transport and industry and hardly at all in the power sector.
So we're running a little bit late, and I don't think I see hands up right now. So we've got some really exciting breakout rooms as well that where we've got 5 different folks that are going to go into more depth on a lot of these questions. So maybe we can switch over to those now. And if there's someone that you really want to ask more questions, you can chase them into